All the talk around the Jets has been about a potential trade for Davante Adams, but now there's a receiver who may be available who makes more sense. We'll talk about who it is and why he makes more sense than Adams today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, July 17th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on the podcast source, give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. The playoffs have wound down, and the sports have stopped sporting like we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Today, on the show, we have our weekly mailbag. Each Wednesday, we try to do a mailbag with listener questions. Thanks so much to everybody who sent in questions. Let's begin. Our first question is about Brandon Aiyuk. John, Brandon Aiyuk has reportedly requested a trade from the San Francisco 49ers. Do you think the Jets should be interested? How would you compare Aiyuk with trading for Davante Adams? Yeah, I think the Jets should absolutely be interested in Aiyuk. Aiyuk's the kind of guy I want for the Jets. Guy who's in his prime or just entering his prime, coming off his best season. And he's still, he's 26. So I look at this 26 versus 31. He's 5 years younger. And for the Jets, I want guys who are going to be good this year, but I also want guys who are going to be good in the future. Now, what's the price going to be? I think that's an obvious question. If San Francisco is going to demand multiple first-round picks, and Adams conceivably, and I'm not saying that he is, I'm just throwing out a hypothetical. If Adams is available for a much lower price, then you could talk me into Adams, but I think Aiyuk's a much more attractive target for the Jets just from the standpoint that, he's younger and he's in his prime. He's around that age group with the young core the Jets have. He's around the same age as like a Garrett Wilson. So, Aiyuk and Wilson, those are two guys who could be a great 1-2 punch, maybe the best 1-2 punch in the NFL for years to come, for a 5-6 year stretch if you get him. And, I think Aiyuk brings a lot of elements that the Jets would love to have. He's a big guy. He can handle press coverage. He can win contested catches. He's a good route runner. He's a complete receiver. In fact, if you look last year with San Francisco has about 3 or 4 guys who could be a number one target in the passing game. They're not all receivers. Deebo Samuel Cannon has been in the past. George Kittle's a tight end, but he's one of the few tight ends in the league who could be a number one target. Even Christian McCaffrey, you could make a case he could be like a number one target in the passing game. Maybe I'm going a little too far putting a running back in that group, but I think he could be. And Aiyuk was the number one target for the 49ers in the passing game. So that tells me something. It says to me something that even in a loaded skill position group, this was the go-to guy in the passing game. As always, it comes down to price. If San Francisco is going to ask for a ridiculous amount, then maybe a pass on it. But I think Aiyuk's really good. And you could say there are two ways you could look at his 2023 season. You could say, well, that's a career year. He's going to come down to earth. Or you could say, he's an ascending player. And, I keep hearing this talk about Davante Adams. And I mean, I'm not crazy about it because I don't think Adams' contract is particularly good. And there's not really a lot of indication outside of like Aaron Rodgers saying he wants the Jets, he wants to play with Davante Adams again. This whole thing with Davante Adams seems entirely generated by Aaron Rodgers and by reporters being bored in the offseason, whereas Aiyuk is asking for a trade apparently. Now, do I think San Francisco is going to trade Aiyuk? Not really, because this is a team that almost won the Super Bowl last year, and with a high-end player, even if his contract situation is uncertain in the future, generally speaking, you're going to want to roll with him because the 49ers were one play away from winning the Super Bowl last year. This is a team that you want to talk about win now. How about coming a play from winning the and they were a play from winning the Super Bowl multiple times. So do you want to trade the guy who was your leading receiver last year? I don't know that they would necessarily want to do it, but in a world where both of these guys are available and they come at the same price, for me, Aiyuk's a far more attractive target for the New York Jets. Now, I know Rodgers has chemistry with Davante Adams in the past, but I feel like Rodgers would develop chemistry with Aiyuk pretty quickly. And it's not to say, none of this is to say that if Davante Adams becomes available, the Jets should just have no interest at all. Of course they should, but I would just be very hesitant if the Raiders were asking for a big price for Adams. If Adams comes for cheap, if he comes for like a pick that's maybe late day 2, early day 3, then it might be worth it, because you want to load up this receiving group. I think the Jets receiving group right now on paper looks pretty solid. I don't think you ever win or lose the Super Bowl because of the identity of your number 3 receiver. But I think the biggest aspect of getting another big time receiver in here is just the insurance factor. Can the Jets roll with what they have at the number 3 receiver group between Lazard, Gibson, and Corley? They probably can. They'll probably be fine because the third receiver really isn't that big a part of your offense, because Garrett Wilson's going to get the bulk of the targets as the number 1 guy. Mike Williams is going to get the bulk of the targets as the number 2 guy. You're going to have your targets for your tight ends, Conklin and Rucker. You're going to have targets for your running backs like Breece Hall. So your number 3 receiver is not really that big of a factor in your offense. He becomes a big factor in your offense if you suffer an injury. So I think as much as anything, the Jets in this win now season, why would you bring in another receiver? Look, you bring in another receiver, somebody's stats, if not everybody's stats, are going to suffer to an extent because there are only so many targets to go around. The reason you're getting another big receiver isn't because you're going to have 3,000-yard receivers. It's because you're just making sure that if somebody goes down, you're not hurting, because the Jets are an injury at receiver away from either Garrett Wilson or Mike Williams away from having an issue at receiver, kind of being like where you were a year ago, where you didn't really have a whole lot beyond Garrett, and that's the biggest reason Mike Williams is here. Beyond the breakfast sandwich that was sent to Florham Park, beyond that, that's the biggest reason Mike Williams is here, because the Garrett needed a compliment. I think that if you get Aiyuk, to me, he's the number 1 receiver. I think Aiyuk's one of the best receivers in football, and with the caveat that 2023 was his best season by far. But I look at his game. Again, really good route runner, guy who can work. I think multiple levels of the field, guy big enough to beat press coverage. There's just a lot I like about his game. I just feel like his game is built to last. In the same way, not in the same way Garrett Wilson's game is built to last, but I think both of those guys, they both have games skill sets that make me very confident that they're going to be very good players going forward. So look, I would at least I'd at least check in on Aiyuk's availability, because I think he'd be a tremendous addition for the Jets. Now, would the 49ers want to trade him to the team that they're playing week 1? That'd be quite a storyline, wouldn't it? Aiyuk returns to San Francisco in a Jets uniform. We'll see. I'm skeptical that a deal would happen. And I think also at this time of year, deals are speculated about frequently because we're in the dead period of the offseason. Fortunately, next week training camp begins, so we'll be in a bit of a more lively period. But at this point of year, I feel like for every trade that's speculated about, maybe 1 out of 100 actually results in a blockbuster deal. And I think that the incentive structure right now is not conducive to a trade being made, because we're not at the point of the season where if you trade a really good player on your team, you can't replace him. You do it in March, you get a draft pick. Maybe you can use a draft pick to replace the player, or maybe you sign a free agent to replace a player. At this point of the calendar, you really don't have any way to replace a big time player you lose. So I think the incentives are against it. And I think this is really just Aiyuk trying to make some noise. I think it's a kind of a play by Aiyuk to try and get the 49ers to cave and give him a new contract. It's the old game that's being played in the media. But I think he'd be a great fit. I think he'd be a great fit anywhere. I'd be really happy if the Jets were somehow able to do it. I'm not expecting it, but hey, I guess anything can happen. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, most of our attention is focused on training camp, but we do have a question about Aaron Rodgers' absence from minicamp. How big of a deal was it? Should Jets fans be worried? Is it endemic of a bigger issue with Rodgers? I'll give you my thoughts on this. I'm skeptical that this is a big deal, and I'll explain why continuing here on this Wednesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. I love sports. Obviously, I love sports. I have a football podcast. I love sports so much that I never want them to stop. But as the playoffs have wound down in basketball and hockey, and football season hasn't gotten underway, we have fewer games. And the sports aren't sporting like I want them to. But FanDuel allows you to keep the sports going whenever you want. All you have to do is open up the app and dream up bets anytime you're in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Baseball's in full swing. Yankees off to got off to a great start, maybe not so much lately. Mets did not get off to a great start, playing better as the season has progressed. And there are other places you can get in on the action on FanDuel. So head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. Big shout out to everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Our next question here on our weekly mailbag is from Chris. Hi, John. Welcome back from your time off. We missed you. Thank you, Chris. That's very nice of you. And I'm sorry, this episode's getting up a little bit late today. It's been a hectic Wednesday for me, so I apologize. This is getting up a little bit later in the day than we typically do. So thank you for indulging me in that. Chris's question: if it's not too late, can I add one more comment / question about the Aaron Rodgers missing mandatory minicamp? Granted, I never played on an NFL team, so I can only guess what's accepted in the locker room or not. Although it does seem to me that it makes a difference that he did attend all of the non-mandatory practices. And also, how is it that all of these guys who have been killing him in the media never mentioned that he voluntarily gave back $35 million last year to help them have a better team? Maybe he should have been there, but the way he's being portrayed as some selfish bad guy seems a bit out of line and not reflective of the whole situation. Would love to hear your thoughts on that. I think those are good points, Chris. I'm a huge skeptic on the value of minicamp. I'm a huge skeptic on the value of the offseason program. I think Rodgers is a lightning rod, and some of this he's brought on himself. Some of it he hasn't. It's a very complex path to get on this road. We don't have to go all the way down it. Rodgers has essentially become a guy who, if he does anything, it's going to generate attention. It's going to generate controversy. And again, some of it's his fault. Some of it's not. And some of it's just, we don't have a lot to talk about in the late spring and early summer. So I feel like, there's so many content creators out there like myself, and, I'm probably guilty of it sometimes. We have to figure out something to talk about. So some story like this becomes a huge deal. Now, what would you say? Should Rodgers have been there? I mean, I don't know. I think Chris hit on a point. Chris said, I haven't played. Chris said he has never played in the NFL, and I've never played in the NFL. And beyond that, most of the people prognosticating about what Rodgers did have not played in the NFL. Rodgers skipping this mandatory minicamp, and I've spoken with players about it. The importance of the offseason program, and it's a subjective thing. It's a matter of opinion. But every single player I've spoken with and asked this question, if you may have heard it a time or two on this show, or sometimes off the show, they've all said the same thing. They say, if you're a young player and you're developing and your technique's a little raw, these practices can help because you get to work on your technique. You get to learn how to play the game. You build a little bit of momentum if you want to have improvement this coming season. For veteran players, it's not that big of a deal. For guys who are established, it's not that big of a deal. I mean, Aaron Rodgers knows how to play quarterback. You think, let's put it this way. If Aaron Rodgers has a bad season, who's going to say, man, him skipping that mini camp is the reason? It's not going to be that. It's going to be, probably because he's too, well, I don't want to talk about Rodgers having a bad season, but it's not going to, nobody's going to point to a Rodgers disappointing season and take it back to the mini camp. Look, he can do it. Look, the Jets seemed unhappy with it. The Jets fined him for it. Just gave him that slap on the wrist fine when they could have just excused it. I think, the Jets would have rather had him there, but I think they also acknowledge it's not that big of a deal. Look, the Jets have made it clear that Rodgers is going to get special treatments. And the reality of it is most quarterbacks of Rodgers' pedigree in the NFL receive special treatment to a certain degree. The Jets are a little bit more open about Rodgers, the special treatment he receives, and they give him a little bit more than a lot of other teams give their quarterbacks, even guys of Rodgers' stature. But I just don't think it's that big of a deal. I think that the freak out that happened as a result of that comes down to a couple of factors. One, Rodgers is a lightning rod. Yeah, anything he does he's going to be controversy. I remember last year, I was watching this with my dad. I was watching the Get Up show on ESPN, and the top story of the Get Up show on ESPN in August was how the Jets offense did in a joint practice with Carolina in the 2-minute drill. And I couldn't stop laughing that people are trying to break down this 2-minute series in practice. But that's the attention Aaron Rodgers draws. And the second thing is, again, it's a time of the year where the NFL, everybody says the NFL is a 12-month league year. it's really more a 10 and a half month of 10 and a half month of 12 year, because like there's like this like little 6 to 8 week period. It's around this time of year where, the offseason program is winding down. There isn't really a lot going on. The draft is passed, free agency's passed. We're not to training camp yet, but there's not really a lot to talk about. So you just kind of like have to figure out new topics to talk. That's why this Davante Adams thing has gone so crazy. I haven't seen any indication the Jets are actually anywhere near a deal for Davante Adams. And I go back to something I said last week. I think that if there is a deal for Davante Adams, it's going to be down the line. I'm not saying the Jets won't trade for Davante Adams. I think it's plausible, but there's really nothing to suggest the teams are anywhere. There's nothing to suggest the Raiders are interested in dealing him right now. But, Roger says something, so now the speculation begins. And hey, like I said on the show the other day, it's great for someone like me because we don't have a lot to talk about, so we can talk about Davante Adams. I think it's something like that where, it's like, oh, should Roger? It becomes like this huge think piece. Should the quarterback be there at mandatory minicamp? And in reality, I think a lot of it depends on the team. A lot of it depends on the player. A lot of it depends on the quarterback. I mentioned this earlier in the summer. I'm a lot more concerned about the Hassan Reddick not being a mandatory minicamp, because Reddick's absence at minicamp came with a message. To the extent I care about somebody not being at minicamp, I care if the reason is that it's the player's trying to send a signal he's unhappy with the team, whether he wants a trade, whether he wants a new contract. Rodgers has zero dissatisfaction with the Jets, nor should he. I mean, the Jets have bent over backwards to try and accommodate him since he joined the team a year ago. So I don't really think so. Since there's no sign of conflict between the Jets and Rodgers, I can't go crazy about it. I think people are going overboard. I think it's just the typical stuff you see. And would the Jets have liked him there? Well, yeah, of course the Jets would have liked him there. They would have excused him otherwise. But I think the Jets also realize that once the games start, nobody's going to be looking back to mandatory minicamp as any sort of indication of how the team's going to do in the season ahead. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to the other side of the ball. Now, if Aaron Rodgers generates all the attention, run defense does not generate quite as much. But the Jets have made some changes this offseason. Has it made their run defense better or worse? Well, I have some thoughts on that, and I'll give them to you as we continue here on this Wednesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by LinkedIn. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. And that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help you find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn is not just a jobs board. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals you can't find anywhere else, even those who are not actively searching for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. On LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. Hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. LinkedIn knows small businesses are wearing so many hats and may not have the time or resources to hire. And LinkedIn is constantly finding ways to make the process easier. They even launched a feature that helps you write job descriptions, making the process even easier and quicker. 2.5 million small businesses use LinkedIn for hiring. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's LinkedIn.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Wednesday. We're doing our weekly mailbag show. Our next question. Hey, John, the rushing defense finished 25th last year. Were any players brought in to help this year? How would you go about improving the defense against the run? I mean, I think the run defense actually got worse because they traded away the best run-stopping defensive lineman, John Franklin Myers. He was a critical part of, I think, to the extent the Jets to the extent the Jets could hold their own and run defense, the games where they played okay against the run, John Franklin Myers was a key component. Now, I think there is one upgrade. I think Hassan Reddick's a better run defender than Bryce Huff, but the way the Jets defense works, people think of it as like a 4-3 style defense. Now, there's really no more 3-4 versus 4-3 because teams are playing the nickel all the time. So you don't really have that extra linebacker on the field. You have 5 defensive backs. So front seven's really become a front 6 because you have 6 combined defensive linemen and linebackers and 5 defensive backs in today's NFL. But the Jets defense, a lot of people think to the extent of like it resembles a defense of yesteryear. A lot of people think it resembles a 4-3 because they play with a 4-man defensive line most of the time. Although there are moments where Jermaine Johnson rushes like from a stand-up position where it's more like a 3-4. But I think the Jets defense in many ways resembles more a 3-4 because the 3-4 defense is all about having big guys on the defensive line eat up blocks. And I felt like last year the Jets defense almost had like two different defensive end positions. You had your Jermaine guy, your Huff guy. In the past it was the Carl Lawson guy. And that's the guy who just shoots up the field, who tries to get to the quarterback. On the other side, you had the John Franklin Myers, and Michael Clemens also played that role a little bit. And if you watch the film, they don't shoot up the field. Their first job is to fill the gap. They essentially go right into their guy, and then they get into a bull rush. And the reason they go right into their guy is that they're able to occupy the gap. So that way nobody's able to run to the left or the right. And, essentially their job is preventing the offensive line from opening a big hole in the gap to either side of them. And the reason for that is, as I've spoken about extensively on this show over the last couple of years, this Jets defense is all about speed in the back seven. Jets like to play fast guys, but fast guys are typically smaller than slow guys. Fast guys tend to be smaller than your typical player. That's the reason they're fast. So having that big guy who can box, having that big guy who could occupy offensive players, John Franklin Myers, that was key. That was key to this defense. That was key to making this defense work. Not having John Franklin Myers changes things. And look, since Robert Saleh took over as Jets head coach, the Jets defense has really prioritized defending the pass over defending the run. And rightly so. It's a cliche, but it is a passing league. Shutting down the pass is more important than shutting down the run in the NFL. And for years, Todd Bowles was here, when Rex Ryan was here, even when Greg Williams was here. Jets had a lot of shutdown run defenses and never got them anywhere. So I agree with the general principle that you look to shut down the run, that you look to shut down the pass over shutting down the run. I do think the Jets may struggle a little bit with JFM out of the lineup this year, though. And I don't know how they're going to stop the run. I think this could be an issue. Now, look, the Jets are going to be really good against the pass because they're going to be able to get after the quarter. They're going to be able to blanket other teams' receivers, and that's more important. Again, that's more important. I'd rather be, if you can give me the option of shutting down the pass or shutting down the run, I'm shutting down the pass every single time. But I do think it might be an issue. Next question. I know it takes two to tango, but if you could, would you attempt to extend our future core? Wilson, Sauce, Brees, Michael Carter II, Jermaine this year? So of those guys, Michael Carter II is the only one who can sign before the end of the season because a player has to have 3 full seasons under his belt before he signs an extension. So Michael Carter II can sign an extension, and Jets do that quickly. I think the broader question is, should the Jets be proactive? Yes. Lock these guys up early. It only gets more expensive. The salary cap's only going to go up higher. You lock them in as early as you can. I want to see the Jets be proactive here because at the end of the day, the longer you wait, the more you pay for it in the long run. So I am 100% of a proponent of extending these guys. Now, I would be a little bit more hesitant with Brees because he's a running back, and running backs don't age well. So I'm not against extending Brees, but like Sauce Gardner, you reset the market. There's no price that's too big for Sauce Gardner. You just do it. It's fine. Garrett's going to get a very expensive contract. No issue with extending Jermaine Johnson, and Michael Carter II already should be extended. So I'm all for it. Please do it, Jets. That's all I got to say. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the show. Enjoy your Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.